Nation, what if I told you there's a type of aircraft you can fly today that burns no avgas? It's so quiet, the neighbors won't mind at all. And believe it or not, it doesn't require a medical certificate. Well, there is such a machine, and it is available to us, and it's called a glider. Let's talk about it. First, let's do a little bit of a history lesson. The first guy to really seriously get into gliders, and I know there were a lot of people, Leonardo da Vinci, the Chinese, all sorts of things in ancient history, but the first guy who actually wrote down what he did and it was witnessed was an Englishman named George Cayley. Now, George was kind of an upper crust dude, and he was very into experimentation. He actually started experimenting with gliders way back in 1799. Seriously, long time ago. By 1853, he had what he thought was a practical model, something that they could actually get in the air and try. And they did that. But of course, by that time, by 1853, George was 80 years old. So not really the best choice for a pilot, but being an aristocrat, he had some latitude, and he assigned the job of being the first heavier-than-air flight captain, pilot for his glider. He assigned it to his coachman, basically his driver. Not the way we would do this today, but while the coachman wasn't all that enthusiastic, I guess in those days, a job's a job and you do what the guy tells you to do. Thankfully, our safety systems are a little better than that today, but that flight actually happened. George Cayley's imagined machine, flown by his driver, really did work. So that was the birth of gliders. After George Cayley, and not a whole lot after George Cayley, came a couple of German brothers, Otto and Gustav Lilienthal. Otto and Gustav started designing and building gliders. Otto was the more notable of the two, although Gustav lived a very long life and did all sorts of things. He ended up trying to build aircraft with flapping wings. Never really worked well, but his brother Otto really shook the world. As a matter of fact, Otto built a number of glider options and was so into it, he actually built his own hill in order to fly the machines, which he flew thousands of times. You see, in the old days, when somebody like Otto Lilienthal wanted to fly gliders, really the way they did it was they physically held the glider as they ran downhill to build up enough speed to eventually catch some lift and fly down to the ground below. That was really the only methodology of getting a glider into the air back then. Now, the work of Otto and Gustav Lilienthal was successful enough, and it made print enough times and in enough places that it caught the attention of two American brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright. You've probably heard of them. And believe it or not, Orville and Wilbur started flying kites, which they then went to unmanned gliders, then manned gliders, and then obviously in 1903, they flew the famous Wright Flyer that hangs in the Smithsonian today. You see, back then, especially with Otto and Gustav, the aircraft were weight shift. The pilot was holding the aircraft up and had to shift his weight forward and back for pitch, left and right for roll, and there really was no yaw. So they were controllable, but not all that controllable. Today, gliders are much more advanced and have been for a number of years. There's a traditional fuselage and wings and tail service. There are devices in the wings, flaps, speed brakes that make it easier and more predictable to fly them. And they even have traditional seats so you can be comfy while you're flying your glider. By the way, one of the concerns we always have with aviation is cost. It's just expensive to buy an airplane. Well, that is true, but you know that weight shift thing that Otto Lilienthal was doing, that still exists today. Hang gliders are weight shift gliders. They're very popular, they're very common, but amazingly enough, you can buy one for as little as $2,000. So gliders may be the lowest cost entry point of all aircraft. Maybe one of the advantages of hang gliders is they are so light and so simple, they're actually not considered aircraft, they're considered ultralight vehicles. Now, because of that, there is no pilot certification required. There's no medical required. There's no training required. They really are the low end of the market with a very high fun factor. So you can get into hang gliders affordably. You can stay in hang gliders for as long as you want. And although there is no training required, I know you know, Jason and I are going to tell you, get some anyway. As a matter of fact, don't just get some, get really good training. Go to a facility with a good reputation. You can have an enormous amount of fun with the low end of the glider realm, but you still want to know what you're doing. So take that training part seriously. It's a big, big deal. Now, being a pilot, or at least a student of aeronautics, and as a member of the nation, you most certainly are that, you might be asking yourself, how do we get a glider into the air? It's a good question. In the old days, Otto Lilienthal would have worn the glider and run down a hill, into the wind, hopefully, eventually catching enough lift that he could glide down to the surface below. Well, that method still works. It's common with hang gliders. There are even some more traditional type gliders where the pilot wears it, runs down the hill in a very short distance, picks up some lift, and then tucks his or her feet up into the cockpit area and flies it as a more traditional glider. Of course, we also have the very common method of towing it. A glider can be hooked to a tow plane and pulled up to 2, 5, 10,000 feet, whatever you need to do. Or you could use a winch. Believe it or not, there are places where instead of a tow plane, instead of running down a hill, a winch is connected to the glider, and as that winch rapidly pulls in the cable, the glider transitions up into flight. Then you can ride a thermal to get higher and higher, or what's called ridge lift. As the wind flows into a mountainside, that air is forced upward, and as it is forced upward, the glider can ride that ridge lift for quite a while. One of the big differences between training in an airplane and training in a glider is the method of a lesson. When we go on a lesson in an airplane, traditionally, in general, we want to get away from the airport. We'll take off, we'll depart the pattern, and go to the practice area. It's there that we'll work on our air work. We'll learn basic skills of controlling the airplane. We'll go through our emergency procedures. But we want to be away from the airport when we do that. In gliders, we actually tend to want to stay near the airport, especially early on in your training, because glider flights can be quite brief. If you get towed up to 2,000 or 3,000 feet, that flight might only last 10 or 15 minutes. So you don't want to be that far away from the airport if you need to get back, if you're in a situation where the aircraft's just descending. Because remember, you have no engine. It's all about energy management, and you can swap altitude for airspeed, but that means you have less altitude every moment you're in the air. So in the airplane, we get away from the airport. In the glider, at least during the training phase, we tend to stay very close to the home airport so we can get back for landing. By the way, you don't have to jump into glider training with both feet. This is an add-on for most of us. It's something we do for adventure, to learn some new skills, to see another part of aviation up close and personal, where we can tangibly grasp the controls and see what it's like to fly this new machine. Now, when we book time in an airplane, maybe we're going on a discovery flight. Maybe we're going on a familiarization flight. We could do the same thing with a glider. In the airplane, we'll typically book for a half an hour or an hour or 2 hours. We always measure the duration of the flight in terms of the Hobbs meter. How long are we going to be flying? Gliders are a little different. How long the flight lasts depends on a whole variety of factors. The weather, the geography, where are you? What type of a sailplane or a glider are you flying? What's your skill level? All of those things can have some type of impact on how long that flight goes. So when you go for a glider flight, very often the price is dictated by how high is the tow plane going to take you. If you're using a tow plane and you're going to 2,000 feet, that would be one price point. If they're towing you to 3,000 feet, that would be another. If you're going to 5,000 feet, a completely different price. How long the flight lasts is up to the conditions, the aircraft, and the skill of the pilot. But the price is just based on how high is the tow. Now, honestly, for most of us, the glider rating is an add-on. We generally already have our private pilot, our commercial pilot airplane certificate. We add on the glider because it's a different experience. It's a very high aspect ratio wing, very long and thin, lots of adverse yaw, so we need a lot more rudder when we fly it. That's part of the experience. We learn to be better pilots, just like when we learn to fly a tail dragger, we become a better pilot in a tricycle gear airplane. The prerequisites for an airplane pilot to add on a glider rating really aren't that tough. As a matter of fact, it's kind of exciting. You'll need to have a minimum of 40 hours of piloting a powered aircraft. That's actually not that tough because 40 hours just happens to be the requirement to get a private pilot certificate under Part 61. So odds are good you already meet that threshold. In addition to that 40 hours in powered aircraft, you'll need to have at least 3 hours in gliders and at least 10 solo flights. And remember, glider lessons being what they are, those solo flights might be quite brief or fairly long. It entirely depends on your circumstances on that day. You'll also need to do 3 glider flights with an instructor in preparation for your practical test. Now, in the powered aircraft world, you have to be 16 to solo an airplane. You need to be 17 to get your private pilot certificate. That's not the case with gliders. Gliders, because they are different machines with different operational parameters, don't require such a high age range. Yeah, that's true. You can solo a glider at 14 years old. You can earn your private glider certificate at 16. So if you've got children who want to get involved in aviation along with you, gliders might be a great way to go. Your children can get involved in a hands-on, tangible way. They can get good training right beside you. And should they decide to get into powered aircraft later on, those skills are absolutely transferable. If I've piqued your interest with this discussion, if you're starting to think, you know, he might be right, gliders might be a great thing for me to try, let me give you a couple resources that are going to be helpful to you. The first is 14 CFR 61.109. That's Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 61.109. You probably think of them as the FARs, the Federal Aviation Regulations. Part 109 is going to tell you what the requirements are to get a glider rating. Now, I know I've already told you, it's in this video, we've discussed it, I know you wrote it down because you're a serious student, but what if I'm wrong? What if the regulations changed between the time I taped this and the time you saw this? Always, always, always research regulations. The second resource I'll throw out to you is the Soaring Society of America. It only makes sense. Flying gliders is very different from flying airplanes. And while aircraft pilots are a very small segment of society, glider pilots are an even smaller segment. So it makes sense that they would have their own organization to not just promote flying gliders, but also to share resources and information and lobby for them when need be. So the Soaring Society of America, you can find it online, has a great deal of information and just might be a good way of finding a provider of training and aircraft rental near you that you can really count on. So now you've got a new adventure to consider. It just might be time for you to add a few glider flights to your logbook. And let me throw a little extra twist in here that might intrigue you. A motor glider is a glider. Yes, it has a motor. It can take off under its own power. It can do a go-round if necessary. But motor gliders are considered gliders. So you can solo a motor glider at 14. You can get your glider certificate in a motor glider when you're 16. And you can fly a motor glider without a medical because it's a glider. There are a whole bunch of reasons why gliders and motor gliders might be a great idea for you. So give it some thought. This just might be your next great adventure. Oh, and while you're headed down this road, would you please do me a big favor and remember, a good pilot is always learning. See you next time.